Hello, I would like to welcome you all for our panel, which is just a second. It's China panel 2, the geopolitical economy of the rise of China. The first paper is China in Contemporary Capitalism, which I'm presenting. I'm Esther Majerowicz, by the way. And the second paper is going to be the political economy of Brazil-China relations, Reprimarisation of Development Opportunities by Sam-Kee Cheng. And the third paper is China and the International Order, Revisionist Power or Reformist Actor by Zeynab Fahardi, which is online with us. So to start today, we're going to follow the order that I just introduced with the presentation. And hence, I will be the first presenting. I believe we should have like 20 minutes each, yes? So I will start with my presentation here. And I'm not using slides. So I'm just gonna speak what I prepared to you for today. Just a second that I will put the chronometer here to control the time, and I'll start. So the paper I'm presenting, it's called China in Contemporary Capitalism Toward the Southern Perspective. This paper actually is based on the concluding chapter of an homonyms book that we published last year at Brill. The book is a collective effort to understand China in contemporary capitalism, and it has as authors Edemilson Paraná, Carlos Medeiros, Isabela Nogueira, Valéria Ribeiro, Hao Chi, and I. So it's mostly an effort of Brazilian scholars together with Hao Chi to provide a broad interpretation of China's more recent economic development. So in the concluding chapter of this book, Paraná and I, we attempt to synthesize and articulate the main contributions in the book in a broad interpretation, which also includes some new perspectives and ideas we developed later on. So we decided to adapt this concluding chapter as a standalone paper, following the suggestion of some scholars who read it. And since the chapter goes beyond the mere summarization of others' contributions, and it brings contributions on its own, we decided to pursue this idea of publishing it as a paper, a standalone paper. So I'm going to show you just for a second, the image of the cover of the book from which we draw the contributions from. So let's begin actual discussion on the paper. So we believe that given the growing geopolitical and geoeconomic polarization between the United States and China, the contemporary debate about China has been marked by an excessive focus on the geopolitical aspects of China's rise. Within the West, several authors have been advancing a reading of reality as primarily and fundamentally framed by the polarity between an imperialist bloc, which would be a US-led global north, and a supposedly anti-imperialist bloc, equated with the global south. And the latter would include Russia as well as China, whose rise would represent a progressive process in the constitution of a multipolar world. Some theses currently in vogue among Marxists go further in announcing that interstate rivalry should be directly conceived as class struggle as such. Of course, such a reading of reality entails not only political consequences, inasmuch the informed leftist currents, but also presupposes a series of other characterizations regarding the regime that exists in China, its mode of production, the nature of the party state, and the Chinese Communist Party. We think that in this analysis, there is often a neglect of social class interests, especially in shaping state policies and the role of class struggle. The idea of the presentation here is to propose an interpretation of how class struggle in China bears consequences to interstate rivalry, in particular to the evolution of US-China relations. Such relations between China and the US have evolved from an amiable competition in backbone of words until the great financial crisis, to the moment, to the framing of, after the great financial crisis, of China by the United States as its main contender. Our departure point is the general characterization that China's transition to capitalism was politically induced by the CCP, while also confirming a developmentalist state. From such a perspective, we contend that China's transition to capitalism under the edges of a developmentalist state was central to materially sustaining the neoliberal globalized form of capitalism and foreign capital, as both domestic capitalists and foreign capitalists benefit from the vast pool of low-wage labor. So here we have two processes, one that's internal and the other that's external. In the domestic side, there's an internal process of class formation that's induced by the party states through primitive accumulation, such as land expropriation, but not direct land expropriation, also through a semi-proletarianization process that includes peasant surplus product extraction, taxes, price seizures, and other means. This process also encompasses the privatization of state and collective assets in the 90s. Of course, the core or the big enterprise were preserved as such, but there was a vast process of privatization. So we situate the establishment of capitalism in China in the 90s with this process, which is a process of proletarianization and therefore the process of commodification of labor power as a necessary condition for production to acquire the form of generalized production of commodities. At the same time, it also constitutes a domestic capitalist class. Although this process is based on primitive accumulation, it does not form a liberal state in China, while the one that predominates at the moment when China integrates in the global economy. So while the important role of planning remains, it becomes indicative and ceases to be mandatory. While the role of large state-owned enterprises, the commanding heights of the economy remains, they become increasingly subordinate to capitalist logic, following profitability parameters, the maximization of shareholder value. So they operate increasingly like large capitalist corporations. So the CCP monopoly of political power was maintained, which is a characteristic of what Medeiros and I call it developmentalism with Chinese characteristics. Moreover, there is a great penetration of political power of the party states over economic power. However, socio-economic processes induced by the CCP, namely the process of class formation, once they unfold, they also affect back the states and alter the nature of the states and the CCP. Nogueira and Kee discuss at length how this process of capitalist class formation also affects the very social conformation of states. For Medeiros, for example, this will imply that the Chinese Communist Party stops being a class party and becomes a party of national character. So we have a change in the very nature of the party and the party state. Although we have a developmental state in China, in the external front, it operates as a support, a central piece in sustaining the advance of neoliberalism as an offensive of capital over labor, launched by the central capitalist classes in central countries, especially in the United States, in an attempt to restore profitability in the context of the profitability crisis of the late 60s and the 70s, leading to a process of liberalization, financialization, globalization, and international productive fragmentation. In this offensive, China appears as a central piece. Chinese low-wage labor was forged here, in this process of proletarianization led by the party states, and its labor force was made available to large transnational capitals, to foreign capitals to exploit. So, in a way, an alliance is created here between the party states and transnational capitals from advanced countries that's forged on the exploitation of Chinese labor power. This is a material base that will erode, and from this erosion and from the erosion of this material base, you have other domestic strategies of accumulation, and you also have a reorientation of relations with transnational capitals, with capitals from advanced countries. The key point here is that this process of exploitation based on low wages, long working hours, along with land expropriation and the extraction of surplus from the peasantry, will intensify class struggle in China. China in the mid-2000s will become the epicenter of the labor movement, of worker struggles, white cat strikes, picket line strikes, even if ephemeral, and peasants' revolts. So this intensification of class struggle, which begins in the mid-2000s and continues until the mid-2010s, will generate a response from the party state, because ultimately it's a process of intensification that could eventually compromise the regime's legitimacy and eventually even the Chinese Communist Party monopoly of political power. From then on, China will forge another accumulation strategy that will aim, on the one hand, to develop indigenous endogenous technologies, and on the other hand, the creation of a welfare state, even if at a moderate level and following a liberal type, as well as supporting a process of wage increases over time. From then on, Nogueira and Cheng discussed it and as Nogueira and Cheng discussed it at length, the state relations with domestic capitalist fractions is reconfigured as a result from this change in the strategy of accumulation. And here we add, it also implies a restructuring in state relations with foreign capitalists. The success of this new strategy of accumulation from the point of view of technological catch-up and its contradictions, because then you also have overproduction in certain sectors, there will be a real estate boom that will cause a bubble and so forth. So it's the success of this new strategy, along with its contradictions, that will end up leading to China's international expansion. At the same time, they will undermine the material foundations of the amiable competition that was at the basis of the axis of accumulation of the world economy, which was the relationship between China and the United States, where the central axis of capital accumulation in the 21st century took place for the first decades. So this relationship begins to be undermined in the sense that you start to lose economic complementarity, the multiple dimensions of economic complementarity that existed between China and the United States, and you start to increasingly enter into a competitive relationship with American capitals. And here you see how class struggle impacts the state accumulation strategy, which in turn, if successful, impacts the state's own relationship with foreign capitals. Several large American corporations then begin to see themselves as rivals of Chinese competitors, and this will lead to a change in their political position regarding China. Now, from the perspective of the formation of American foreign policy, various sectors of American capital that supported a pro-China policy of economic articulation are now opposing it. And so, with this change in the sector of American big capital, they join the voices that have always existed in the defense of the belligerent and aggressive national security interests of the United States. Hence, you change the configuration of domestic forces in the definition of US policy on China. So we move from friendly competition to China as the main rival and threat to the United States. Here we inscribe also the technological dispute between the US and China, which I will not have enough time to discuss here. So as China breaks away with the peripheral condition, increasing intercapitalist and interstate competition, it carries a central contradiction. While China breaks away from its peripheral condition, it reproduces the mechanisms that sustain the center-peripheral junction. Here, Ribeiro provides important contribution. She analyzed the reasons behind the expansion of Chinese capital abroad, particularly from the point of view of foreign direct investment, and gives primacy to the profitability motive, the search for natural resources, strategic assets, technological assets, and space for valorization. These motives reveal that as Chinese capital expands, it is susceptible to reproduce the same trends that operate in capital accumulation at global scale, particularly the trend toward wealth polarization. Therefore, it tends to reproduce the center-periphery junction, including through its investment profile in peripheral countries. In Latin America, from the perspective of all economic restrictions the continent faces, many times the influx of Chinese investment is seen as an action or a movement toward economic development. However, in our continent, we have experienced several waves of foreign direct investment, and the continent remains under development. So Chinese capitals in Latin America often reproduce the pattern and type of investment under British hegemony, that is, to couple and integrate these Latin American economies to the Chinese economy for the export of natural resources, raw materials, and the import of manufactured goods. But China also reproduces new mechanisms of the center-periphery junction, such as the vast investments in digital infrastructure and the export of technological packets, in which Chinese big tech and increasingly digitalized security companies, as they expand, they reproduce the pattern of knowledge monopolization. Although China counted extensively with technology transfer, today it reinforces the global intellectual property system. Its companies not only extract that data from the periphery, but also achieve values transfer through monopoly brands. In this sense, these companies operate in the same way as US big tech. Moreover, there is not only the rentier condition, but also the vast concentration of fixed capital around the world in the form of computing power, which is in the power of large technology companies, whether American or Chinese. And as we know, the projection of these large platforms, this big tech in association with their national states, carry elements of political extraterritoriality. Hence, there is a reproduction that brings elements that do not differ with the expansion from capital from other states, from the actions of other great capitalist powers in this sense. So here, look, I'm not saying whether China is or is not imperialist. I'm not saying that. By expanding, what I'm saying is that by expanding and accumulating its capital on an international scale, it reproduces trends of capital accumulation and polarization of wealth that are placed from an economic point of view and not from a political point of view. Whether it's imperialist, in my opinion, is another discussion. Somewhere else this year, Medeiros and I published a paper which starts from Prebisch analysis, and hence the founder of and leading author of Latin America structuralism. And this paper also goes in line with his main arguments. And we dig further in the characterization of China as a central economy, and the passive accommodation of the Brazilian economy to the ascension and constitution of this new cyclical center. Actually, although the title of this paper, the subtitle, which would be China Contemporary Capitalism, and my presentation was toward the southern perspective, when I submitted already, not liking this point of view, and I'm starting of abandoning the southern category. So actually, although the title of the paper and the presentation discusses a southern perspective, by now I have completely abandoned the category of south for the periphery. In China, if China is breaking away with the peripheral conditional, reproduces the center peripheral junction, it also provokes, from the point of view of other central countries, a process of convergence to non-neoliberal practice toward the instruments that were used in the Chinese development process, such as investment in infrastructure, industrial policy, in several sectors. If, when China forges its developmental states, the word is predominantly neoliberal, now as China succeeds in its rise and intensifies intercapitalist and interstate competition, it at least drags several advanced countries in the direction of using these instruments as weapons in competition on the international stage. So I think this is another important trend from the point of view of the impact of advanced countries, where you have a rapprochement between the state and big capital in sectors that are considered strategic. So we think that the rise of China has to be seen taking into account these domestic class dimensions, how the state responds to the domestic class dimension, and how they, through the accumulation strategy, they impact international relations, that is, relations between national states. Although China positions itself as a promoter of a new international order, a promoter of development for developing countries, it reinforces the economic mechanisms that create the center-periphery junction. And so I think we see today this convergence in relation to non-neoliberal practice in central countries, but now from the point of view of a working class that was defeated in central countries. So the comeback of the state, this action toward the state intervention in central countries is not necessarily for the promotion of a welfare state, but for a militaristic race for the development of sectors that are strategic to big capital and the state's military and repressive apparatus. From the perspective of Latin American periphery, although this international scenario is one of dispute between China and the United States, it has emerged as, let's say, a space for negotiation and for extracting concessions from one side or the other, maybe not so much since the second Trump administration. Even if this supposed space may make it possible to negotiate technological transfers and investment, such space is engendered by a process of competition based on militarization in the arms race. Thus, there is also a cost entailed in this space for the periphery in such supposed opportunities open to the periphery, namely the increase in the systemic risk of war. So I think that basically Chinese expansion does not present itself as an alternative for the periphery. I also think that the characterization of China, US-China competition today, as a new Cold War is misleading. But I have no time to go there now. I finished my time. So I think these are the central elements that we are interested in this paper. Well, that's all I had to say. So thank you very much for your patience. And now I'm going to invite Sam-Kee Cheng to present her paper. Thanks very much.
Brazil-China relations, reprimarisation or development opportunities, who decides? So part of this may respond to some of the things that Esther has mentioned in her presentation, but it is mainly focusing on the actual case of China and Brazil relations and its economic trade and everything first. So again, this is a presentation that's based on a book chapter that I co-authored with Professor Elias Jabu, and it's going to be published in the Palgrave Handbook on Geopolitics of Brazil, Middle and South Atlantic, which is now in the final process of the editor review, so should be coming out sometime in 2026. Okay, so reprimarisation, I think it is a term that is not disfamiliar with our Brazilian colleagues here, because this is a controversial topic that's coming out with the rise of China as well, because one of the things that's developing economist was arguing that, yes, there's a rise of China. China is challenging the US. There's no doubt about it. But with the speed and also the scale that China is expanding, is it going to squeeze out the opportunities for development and also the industrialization opportunities for the developing countries, because the scale of economy is so big in China, and also because its mode of production by and large quite successful, it may make it harder for other developing countries to start on the industrialization drive, because there is intense competition with China, and China seems to be very good with increasing its productivity and also competitiveness. So this may create actually the primarization pattern that may have been seen in the past, that the center periphery, the division, and also the uneven development between China and the rest of the developing countries. So this is one of the theory that's being put forward and argue about the dangers of the rise of China. Before I go into this argument, I would like to take us back to the context of how this primarization, or the signs of primarization that actually started. It's actually started with the rise of neoliberalism with the 70s or 80s, when a lot of these developing countries originally on the path of industrialization drive and developmental projects that have turned to neoliberalism. So in the 1970s, yes, the US was facing contending forces originated from different parts. Ones are from, for example, Western Germany and Japan. They are coming up in the productivity drive, and also they are catching up on the economic development. So became actually a real competitor to the US. So it's affecting the US dominance. At the same time, other developing countries after the Second World War, they had the opportunities to actually adopt the developmental model, especially with the backing of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was there as a systemic competitor to the US, so it offered opportunities and material basis to support newly independent countries to start industrialization process. China was one of them. In the 1970s, also the US was facing the defeat in the Vietnam War. So all these added towards the US that its model was actually under threat. But the US was able to resolve this by dividing the contending forces and also ushered in the neoliberal era that started with the dominance of the US dollars. Even though it could not maintain the Bretton Woods system that it agreed with the other powers in the 1940s, that in 1971 it had to stop this link with gold, and in 73 it just unilaterally pushed out the US dollars as the international monetary unit, but without the backing of the gold, and still has to be accepted by other countries. So the US was able to do this, and then turned also on the neoliberal doctrines that it's promoted to the world, saying that the state should not be involved in the economic sphere, should be withdrawn from all the economic decision planning and everything. So the market should take the primacy of the economy. So yet, by actually making these doctrines as the supreme goal for the economic system, also with the backing of the IMF and the World Bank, because they are the lenders to these countries as the last resort, at those times that when interest rate was going up and the Western market was stagnating. So it created the debt crisis for a lot of these developing countries. And they had to go to these international financial institutions to go for loans and try to avoid default. So all this made the neoliberal era that's established, because those countries had no other means but to accept these conditions. In the same time, these doctrines also is related to the US plan to withdraw the international division of labor. So it actually stopped the industrialization drive in its competitors, industrial competitors, but also the emerging economies from developing countries. So they had to accept deregulation, flexibilization, and also privatization of their state assets. So all those things that actually could create pressures on US dominance, they actually being loosened because of this imposition of the neoliberal regimes. So the rise of the finance, capital, and the industrial military complex in the US then again regained dominance in the world economy. Before the neoliberal regime that's imposed on Brazil, Brazil actually was one of the model of success in the developmental drive. With the war booms in the two world wars, Brazil actually had a considerable accumulation, and also the government was able to put those accumulations into industrialization efforts. So Brazil, the industry share of GDP grew from 25% in 1960 to almost 40% in 1980. And the working population also grow as well from 14% to 24% in the industrial sector. The GDP per capita in 1980 in Brazil was about 2,000 US dollars compared to the middle income countries of 643 and much higher than China's 994 at that time. So Brazil, in this short period of industrialization drive, showed that it actually was coming out from the others. However, in the debt crisis in 1980s, it had to accept the IMF loans. So also that combined with the structural adjustments that came along with it, and then they had to give up a lot of the things that they hold dear to privatization, and also they have to accept the doctrines that I mentioned earlier. So as we all know, neoliberalization led to increasing inequality, poverty, unemployment, flexibilization of the labor market. So there is a polarization that's growing in the society. China was also under part of this as well, because during the 70s and late 70s and from the 80s onwards, China also adopted policies that some of them were considered similar to the neoliberal policies. For example, opening up of the market, creating a market economy, and also allowing workers or peasants to move to the cities and to work under private companies or under the terms and conditions that no longer was like mandated by the state, but actually accepting terms and conditions that is given to them by private companies. So there was the creation of these labor forces in China and a massive pool of labor resources for capital accumulation. So the symptoms that we see in other economies, there were also some of them in China as well. But then it's not the whole process. China did not go all the way just continuing with the symptoms of neoliberalism. There actually is a divergence of development in Brazil and China when we compare them together. So Brazil, the discontent with neoliberalism led to the victory of the Workers' Party under Lula in 3 terms in 2002, 2006, and 2023. So the government was able to push some pro-poor policies, giving welfare and having like the minimum wage program and subsidies to the poor households. However, in terms of trying to avert the neoliberal tide, it couldn't really stop it, because for the policies they want to rebuild the industry or rebuild the economy of Brazil is largely dependent on the private capital. So the government would give like tax cuts, financial incentives to try to get these companies, large companies, to be involved in delivering some of the national growth plan. But in the end, it wasn't very successful. Deindustrialization was continuing in Brazil. Brazil had a very low capital formation, steepening in financialization, including the commodities markets and control of land by global agribusiness. Weak manufacturing was continuing in Brazil, so the share of GDP of this sector declined from 46% in 1979 to around 15% since 1995. For China, I argue that because there is the primitive socialist accumulation that's ongoing, even though at times it seems very weak when compared to the capitalist accumulation, but it's not being replaced by capitalist accumulation. It's competing with it. So there was a time that China had to give concessions to transnational corporations to try to get foreign investment, technology transfer, but it was not giving them a whole completely free hand. They had to accept the conditionality set by China. For example, certain level of technology transfer, and also capital controls has continuous to be in place in China. So China was also able to grow from a labor-intensive processing trade dominance in the export trade to having the growth of domestic industries in high-tech sectors. So the export sector previously was predominantly by TNC, so the profits were captured by the TNCs. Now, Chinese domestic companies, they are taking a larger share of this export sector, so they are actually competing with the TNCs and seems to be winning. State planning also are still in place. You can see that there are China's 5-year plans and also the large SOEs. They are also part of this planning system that are able to deliver the objectives by the state, not due to the profitability centered kind of investment, but it's due to the national development plan. For example, the expansion in infrastructure investment, and also in cases like during the energy crisis in 2008 to 2010, you may remember there was a fluctuations of energy prices globally. But for the SOE in China, in oil and petroleum, they were the ones that had to provide stability in the Chinese market. So instead of acting like other oil companies that is making big gains in these prices fluctuations, they had to actually give subsidies to the domestic market, give up billions of yuan just to stabilize the energy prices. So they had to buy high from international market, but sell low at home. So this actually is contradicting the profitability logic of private companies. So it's a very significant sign to say that they are not driven by profitability, and they have a higher goal for development that is set up by the state. So more than 40% of Chinese exports in 2022, they are electronic equipment, machinery. So it's just to show that China is actually increasing in its high-tech component in its export trade. And the other thing is the state-controlled financial system is still very much in place, with the state banks that is predominating, is in the predominant position. So foreign banks have very marginal, they have less than 1% of the total banking sector assets in China, and they had no influence in Chinese economy. To China, when I started saying that in the 80s or 90s, the disparity between Brazil and China, and even in the 1990s, you can see, but the GDP per capita, based on the purchasing power parity of these two countries, you can see that China began to surpass Brazil's in 2018. And it is continuing to go up while Brazil was stagnating, seems to be in a plateau. in terms of the China and Brazil trade, is it having the risk of reprimarization? We can tell from the trade pattern and the figures. Now, China is the largest export market for Brazil. It is mainly in agricultural produce, soybeans, corn, sugar. And in 2024 June, Xi Jinping presidency actually went to Brazil, and they had a deal that signed to promote Brazilian coffee. I think is 120,000 tons of coffee beans that is said to be, they want to get it imported to China. And during this commodity trade with China, Brazil has had a trade surplus with China more than $47 billion in 2022. And you can see that at times when Brazil's this is the orange line that is to show that the trade balance in general in Brazil that dropped, but then in 2013 and 14, the surpluses in trading with China that's indicated in the blue line that is over the trade balance. So China's trade with Brazil was giving a very positive impact on its trade balance, is compensating its drop in the trade balance yes, as you can see that the trade with Brazil was predominantly in the agricultural produce. So if this is continuing to be the only kind of trade that they can have, yes, China is mostly importing the primary resources from Brazil. And while this may look like is a kind of primarization, but we have to remember also Brazil's agricultural sector has a very high productivity. So it's one of the leading Brazil's agricultural sectors is one of the most competitive ones in the world because of the high level of productivity. So in Marxist term, if you have a high organic composition of capital in your trade with your partner, if you have a higher OCC, then you actually are the ones that is gaining in this exchange. So it's not an equal exchange in this sense if you have a high productivity product that in exchange in the world market. So compared to China's growth in this sector, China was less than 3%, but Brazil was outcompeting China with a 4% rise. But here we also see another problem for Brazil, that the increase in productivity for these agricultural sectors is unchallenged, 106% from 2000 to 2013. But in other sectors, they completely lagged behind, like in services, 11.7%, manufacturing was even minus 5.5%. So the disparity and the reasons for primarization that you can also see is not because of trading with China, but it's the internal organization of economic sectors that is so lopsided, investment in agricultural and neglect in others. So it is the reasons, the cause for Brazil's commodity-based specialization. And this is also reflected in Brazil's gross capital formation as share in GDP is below the regional average. Brazil's, as a former industrial power in the region, they now are having a below regional average growth from capital formation. And so we can see for China how it was able to break into the formerly exclusive sectors like high-tech sectors. One of the reasons is that it has continuing its investment in the productive investment. So you can see the difference between the two countries here in this graph. So Brazil's lack of investment in infrastructure is a known fact, and the financing gap by 2022 was close to $800 billion. 50% in transport, 24% in energy. while the spending in infrastructure was below 2% of GDP since 2015, if there was an economist parity that was calculating if it wanted to catch up with the East Asian economies like South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, then Brazil's spending in this area should be 7.9%. So you can see how far behind Brazil is in this investment. And the existing monocultural economic model, which is reliance on the agricultural sector, hydropower, has added vulnerability for Brazil in facing climate change. So the power shortages that had happened in Brazil, and also other problems with the agricultural sector with the changes in the climate, the drought, and all those problems could seriously affect Brazil's in its already very vulnerable position. Then we look at China's overseas foreign direct investment and overseas contracted projects in Brazil. Then we can see actually this seems to be a helpful hand because they are investing in infrastructure in Brazil. So this is a comparison of like the total investment in infrastructure in Brazil, the spending in it, and also Chinese investment in infrastructure in this. Then you can see that the Chinese investment in infrastructure in 2015, one of the highest, that is 17.27% of the total investment in infrastructure in Brazil. And in 2017, it was 28.70. Why these figures seems to be sometimes quite high, sometimes quite low? It is also because depending on which years the contracts were signed. So sometimes they would not be completed in 1 year, but then for several years. So some years they would sign deals that will go on for a long period of time. So you can see that it's kind of some years seem quite small, but some years you can see that it's going up. But anyway, in the whole, for the China's construction project in Brazil from 2005 to 2023, the sectoral distribution is very clear. Majority of them is in energy and then in transport. This is the data I've taken from the American Enterprise Institutions and Heritage Foundation, so that you follow the spendings of China overseas very closely. So this is from the data, and this is I was allowed to use this with permission from that institution. So Chinese finance to Brazil from 2007 to 23 was more than $32 billion. 70% were for energy projects. So that is the saying from one of these researchers. China's banks provided more financing to the region than was provided by World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank combined in recent years. And there are also Brazil-China Cooperation Fund that's supporting specific projects, for example, expansion of production capacity for sustainable development, projects in climate, renewable energy, and infrastructure. So this, we can see that it really seems to be trying to plug not the full hole, but actually part of the holes that Brazil urgently needs. So how to harness the opportunities to break the neoliberal doctrine for Brazil then? Dunford and Liu have said this regarding China's strategy in Belt and Road Initiative. China is pursuing gains. That means its interests. Chinese companies undertake infrastructure investment and sell related goods and services. The infrastructure will improve access to markets, raw materials, and cost-competitive production sites, and economic growth will create new and larger markets, while China will garner strategic gains as an emerging global power in a multipolar world. China therefore gains. The goal is, however, to establish cooperation arrangements that are win-win with gains also for China's partners. The distribution of benefit and cost within each country depends, however, on equitable negotiations and also the choices of China's partners. So it is no doubt, it is a transactional relations that the Chinese companies or the investments would not be just entirely tailored just for the needs of the partnering country. They also need to calculate the cost and also their own benefits. But it is not a fixed thing. It's not also something that's being imposed on the partners. They have the room to negotiate, and it's dependent on the choices of the Chinese partners of how far they can harness these booming economic opportunities. However, there are limitations in Brazil. There are state spending caps established by the coup government of Michel Temer. The independence of the central bank that's granted under Bolsonaro government is increasing the control of the finance sector and preventing the implementation of industrial policies. So even if the Lula government wanted to have a very radical development plan, but it's institutionally have obstacles that quite hard to overcome, it's not yet being overcome yet. Neoliberalism as a hegemonic ideology that is predominant in the media, in the NGOs, for example, the Open Society Foundation, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, etc. The private universities that are based on the Western models are also a very big push for the neoliberal ideologies that continue to dominate in Brazil. Reprimarisation that began long before the beginning of the deepening of the trade relations with China. So the problems existed long before this trade with China, as I have argued earlier. And there, however, are active efforts to seek a developmentalist alternative. For example, the BRICS, the New Development Bank, they also have agents that want to push for closer relations with China. But again, another institutional obstacle, there are limited capacity of the federal government in the decision making. So it is very different to China in how things can be organized. Brazil-China partnership for shared destiny. So despite these difficulties, there are still people trying to fight for this to become a reality. Xi's visit to Brazil in November 2024 was significant, trying to boost continuing cooperation. There were agreements in 15 areas, including agribusiness, technology, and education. Investments and partnerships were also established in sectors such as infrastructure, industry, energy, mining, finance, communication, sustainable development, tourism, sports, health, and culture. So governments also trying to revitalize a national project through the synergy between ongoing initiatives in Brazil and the BRI that's pushed by China. So partnership for a shared destiny as global projectment utilizing China's primitive socialist accumulation is a possibility for Brazil. But we also should not be overlooking the difficulties that's existing in Brazil and how to harness it or not. That is still not a very clear or the path that Brazil is taking. But there are efforts in trying to push for this way. So for progressive, I think for progressive, whether Marxist or not, but if for progressives that who want to drive a national independence and also a bridge to the neoliberal agenda, China here, we have seen, can actually offer some opportunities for it, especially on the material basis, and how you can negotiate with China is very different how the US is so-called negotiating with you with the imposition of tariffs that we have seen. So this is why Professor Jabu and me have written this chapter. We are not taking lightly the difficulties, but at the same time, we should not be all pessimistic. So, so this is the end of the presentation, and welcome any comments and feedback. These are the selected references. Thank you. So I think I'll pass it over to Zeynab then. Zeynab is joining us from Hong Kong. Zeynab, yes, you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Hello, good morning to dear colleagues and friends. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Professor Sam-Kee and also other organizers to providing this opportunity for me to present my research about the China and international liberal order. So I would like to share my screen here. So can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. As you see, the topic of my presentation is about the China and international order, revisionist power or reformist actor. Um, in the recent year, by increasing the China power, both in the hard and soft power, actually, we have seen raising these questions about the implication of the rising of China in the international liberal order and how it will impact on the different components of the international liberal order. In this research, I'll try to address two main questions. That first is about what is the China perspective on the global order and which elements of the international liberal order actually China order has China accepted, or which one China has contested them. Based on the research funding, China employs a balanced strategy regarding the international system. Generally, China advocates for a multipolarity and aims to contest the USA hegemony in the security and financial domains via alternative financial institution and initiative, while upholding the specific United Nations principles, including the state sovereignty. So overall, China approach to the international liberal order can be considered as a reformist rather than a revisionist. China wants to amend certain elements of the international liberal order that it's viewed as advantages to the marginalized nation, specifically those in the global south, while refraining from attempting to dismantle the current liberal order. So in general, China approach, it's primarily peaceful and utilizing the soft power mechanism, including the economic alliances and multilateral diplomacy. In this presentation, I will try to address four main parts. First is a very short literature review and the research gaps that we found in the studies that we had. The second is an overview of the international order and its component and the significance of these components. And the third part will be about the perspective of China on the international order. And we will try to see that which components China advocate and which parts China try to amend or challenge them. And finally, we will have the conclusion. Generally speaking, if we want to divide somehow the studies that we have about the China approach to the international liberal order, we can divide them to the two groups of studies. The first one is the realist perspective, and the second is the liberal perspective. In the realist perspective, we mainly know that they try to portray China ambitions to challenge the current liberal order, and they mentioned that the China wants to establish the new liberal order. So, and overthrow the whole liberal order that we have now, this especially the with the addressing the USA hegemony. But in contrast, we have the liberal perspective that they emphasize on the China's non-confrontational approach toward international orders. The main arguments of this group is that the China is the beneficiary of the current liberal order. So why China wants to change this system. So in this regard, China has a little incentive to disrupt the status quo. These are the two main groups of idea or approach about the China relations with the international liberal order. When we studied all of this research, for us, 5 main points is very important to be addressed actually, or somehow I can call them like as a research gap. The first point is the complexity of the international liberal order. Unfortunately, a lot of studies, they only focus on one aspect of the international liberal order, but we know that international order has different components, and it's completely it is a very complex and complex phenomena. So we should actually consider all the components when we are studying this issue. The second is the need for a balanced analytical approach. Actually, this is a very important point when we were studying about the China relations with the international liberal order, that we don't have any, actually rarely we can see a balanced approach about the China and international liberal order, pessimistic approach in the realism, and so optimistic approach about the China in the liberal perspective. So we need a kind of balanced approach when we are studying the China and international liberal order. The third point is the emphasizing on the China order building efforts. A lot of studies actually, they devote insufficient attention to the China initiative to construct its own vision of the global order. So it's this way limit our understanding about the China approach and how China try to participate in the different components of international liberal order. The fourth one, which again is somehow close to the second point, is the risk of oversimplification or exaggeration. Unfortunately, a lot of studies, they try to either oversimplify or exaggerate the threat of China. Again, here we need a balanced approach about the China approach to the international liberal order. And finally, in a lot of research, we see that they define the international liberal order equivalent with the or synonym with the USA hegemony. So everything that they want to talk about the China, they see in the context of the USA and China competition. So again, this prevent us from having the holistic approach, holistic picture of the China and the international liberal order. Before starting the part about the China and the liberal international liberal order, we need to give the definition of the order. The first point is that order is a very contested concept in the international relations. We have a different definition of order by different scholars. The first definition that I've mentioned here is by the Hedley Bull, that this definition is widely accepted in the international relations, that he defined the order as a pattern of activity that sustains the elementary or primarily goal of the goals of the society, of the state, or international society. The second definition is for the Al-Kaba, that he conceptualized the order as a formal or informal arrangements that sustain the rule-governed interaction among the sovereign state in their pursuit of individual collection goals. And then we have the definition by the John Akenbury, that he similarly defined the order as a set of the governing arrangements between state, including its fundamental rules, principles, and institutions. And we have also another definition by the Tan Shiping that he differentiate the definition of the order based on the ontological level and operational measurements that he mentioned that in the ontological level, order is a degree of predictability or regularity of what is going to within a social system, presumably because agents' behavior, social interactions, and social outcome within the social system have all come under kind of regulation. And at the operational or measurements level, the order is measured along 4 dimensions: scope, relative concentration or distribution of the power, the degree of institutionalization along 2 sub-dimensions, and the degree of internationalization. So as we see, we have a different definition by the scholars, but if we want to somehow divide them, we can say that in the realism, they treat the order as a fact, but in the liberal and constructivism, they view order as the rule or value. But the 2 main points I would like to highlight here about the post-war order. The first one is that the multilateralism that we had after the war, after the World War II is characterized by the USA vision of the world politics. And the second point, which is again very important, is that is about the that order lies in the core group of the like-minded state, a group of countries that endorse some degree of shared order, and that together they reflect the critical mass of power and purpose in the international sphere. Here we have the institutional order, which mainly we refer to some international organizations like United Nations, IMF, World Bank, and WTO, that all of these, they provide some platforms actually for the collective dialogue and action in different spheres and issues. And a very important part of this about the international order is that we need to differentiate among the 3 suborders or the different components of the international liberal order. And this differentiation actually led us to this point that the international liberal order is a so dynamic phenomena, I can call it. The first suborders, that is the economic suborder, which like trade order, financial and monetary order, and development order. For the security suborder, we have the UN Charter-based non-aggression order, multilateral security order built on the shared interest in areas like non-proliferation or counter-piracy. And very important part of the security suborder is the USA-led system of alliances. And finally, we have the global liberal values of order, which mainly we have the concepts of the human rights or democracy and so on. And for the final part of this point about the liberal order, that we should pay attention that when we are talking about the change and when we are talking about the dynamics that we have in the international order, is that these changes and transformation will not happen at one time or overnight. So it may one component of international order can change, but like for example economic order, but other will stay in the same status. So in another word, transformation of the whole international order will take a time and happen gradually. So having all of this information in our mind will help us to better understand how China deal with the current international liberal order. Generally speaking, China approach to the different components of the international liberal order differently. So we should not consider a China approach to every components same, because China has a different approach to even different suborders of the international liberal order. And actually it is a very complicated approach, I can call it. But broadly speaking, based on that, reviewing the China behaviors, actions, we can say that China has engaged with the international economic order positively, and maybe a little bit like a reformist in the recent years. But the main part of the international liberal order is the international security order that China in the recent year has been challenging and becoming more competitive. And now let's have more details that how China, which part of the international, for example, economic order China has contested, and which part China support. If we want to divide, we can say that China, some components China support, but for some parts China challenge and also try to amend them. For the economic order, which we have the trade, financial, monetary order, and development order, we can say that it's characterized by a blend of the selective engagement, reform initiative, and strategic objective that all of them aim at sustaining its China economic growth while navigating the global economic governance. We have the participation of the China in the WTO as an example that China doesn't want to fundamentally overthrow the current liberal order. Despite a lot of criticism that we have about the China practices, China involvement in the WTO demonstrate that its recognition of the importance of the established trade rules. In the economic order, actually, we mainly witnessed that China's support for reform, and this reform aimed for bringing more developing countries or so-called global south. This is a very important point that we need to take into the consideration. For which part China challenge in the global economic or suborders, I would say that in terms of the in the financial and monetary order, we can say that China try to enhance the RMB global stand and challenging the dominance of the Western currencies like the USA dollar. This is one point that we see as a challenge that China created for the financial and monetary order, or developing the alternative institution like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the New Development Bank. They are the examples that China tried to create a parallel institutions that somehow they are challenging the current Western-led financial institution. And for the development order, the best example that we have is the BRI, that through the different infrastructure projects in different continents, China tried to create a network of the trade routes and enhance its economic influence globally. And for the trade order, we already mentioned that China follow norms, rules, but in some parts, for example, economic coercion, we can say that China challenged the current trade order. For example, the case of the South Korea and Australia, that China like, for example, for the case of South Korea, that China start to make some challenges for the South Korean business in the China after the when we had this missile defense system that the USA they brought to the South Korea, or the case of Australia after the COVID. So these are the examples that show that China in sometimes use the trade for pursue its national interest, and somehow it's the trade comes to the political era actually. And then China and the international security order. Maybe this is a very important aspects that I would like to highlight about how China challenging the international security order. And maybe this part is in comparative perspective with other suborders is very important. We have different examples that show that China in recent years has challenged international security order. The first one is the military expansion and the regional security. The main example that we have is about the South China Sea and that China actually reclamation, land reclamation that we have in the South China Sea and militarization of artificial islands. These are some examples that can be interpreted as the attempt to alter the status quo and undermining the existing maritime law, such as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So, the second point again here is the challenging the USA-led alliances system, especially in the Northeast Asia and the Southeast Asia. Maybe this is the area, the main area that China has challenged the like security order that we had after the World War II in the East Asia, which was based on the hub and spoke system. And the rejection of the bloc politics also is another point that we need to take into the consideration, that China completely reject this ideological grouping or the military alliances that we have, which China sees this bloc of politics just like the warm, Cold War mentality. So through the initiative like the security, global security initiative, China emphasized on the multipolarity, and rejecting the like the bloc politics, that we divide the world to the based on the ideological things. And but when we talk about the challenging of the international security order, it doesn't mean that China reject all of it. For sure, China, one of the main supporters of the United Nations Charter, China has been so active in the peacekeeping operation. China has been so active in counterterrorist efforts, and also China support the regional security mechanism, especially in the Southeast Asia. China is one of the main partner for the ASEAN, for the Southeast Asian countries, and support for the peace and stability in the region. So all of these examples shows that China support the multilateralism and also the United Nations Charter. And then we have about the liberal value order. The main challenge that China has is about the rejection of the humanitarian intervention that China sees as a violating state sovereignty. And the points that China raises to adopt the context-specific approach. We, in this way, we will respect to the national sovereignty and local conditions. So this is also another point that we need to into the consideration. And now the conclusion. In general, China approach or vision to the international order represent a strategic effort to reshape the global governance in favor of its interests, while promoting a narrative of equality and cooperation among nations, and simultaneously asserting itself as a responsible stakeholder within the current system. Very important points here is that while China, because over the presentation I tried to highlight the points that China challenged them, but these challenges doesn't mean that China wants to overthrow the whole system. Instead, China envisions an international order that accommodates a plurality of values and governance model. So this dual approach reflects China's complex relationship with the global governance and its aspiration for greater influence on the world stage. So labeling China strictly as either revisionist or reformist may oversimplify its strategic objectives and action in the international relations. So whether this vision lead to preservation or transformation of existing order remains a very critical question for the global stability and cooperation. There are also two other main points that I would like to highlight as a conclusion. The first point is that China engagement with the liberal international liberal order is very slow and a gradual and evolving process of interaction. Both China and the global order are dynamic entities. And so the interplay of between China and the global order actually, we need to take into the consideration that both of these entities, they are dynamic entities. They evolve over the years. So over the years, in the recent years, we see that how China evolved from passive integration to the active shaping. And the second point is that while we are highlighting the points that China challenged some aspects of the international security order, but China doesn't want or China does not endorse the anarchy. And China completely reject the anarchy in the international system. And for China, stability and incremental reform actually prefer over the revolutionary overhaul. So this is also another point that we need to take into the consideration. And finally, the implications, especially this part is about the future trajectory and about the future scenario of the China and the international liberal order, that we need to take two points into the consideration. The first one is that China interaction with other states, particularly USA and other Western countries, will determine the future of the global world order. It doesn't mean up to now, we've talked a lot about how China will impact and how will challenge or already does, but about the future, the China future action highly dependent on the responses of other powers. So China is not the solely actor in the international liberal order. Other countries' response also will impact on the China and the international liberal order relationship. And the second point is that China domestic trajectory, China domestic issues like political stability, economic growth, or challenges that China already faces, like democratic decline, the impact on the China future involvement with the international liberal order. So our conclusion is here that the international liberal order is likely to experience both transformation and continuity in the coming years. China and global system and its components will evolve together, potentially leading to a more multipolar framework. And the interplay of the cooperation and competition will define the future trajectory of liberal international order. And with China's role as both participant and also as a challenger remain central in this process. So here is the end of my presentation, and very much for your attention. I hope I finish on time, not talk too much.
Thank you, Zeynab, for your presentation. I believe we have more like 10 minutes of the session. So if anyone wants to make a question, a comment, the floor is open. Okay.
I will quickly maybe respond to some of the arguments that Esther, you raised in your presentation, because I think my research is actually have been doing quite a lot on trying to counter some of the arguments in those that you have presented. Because I argue that China is not a capitalist system, even though during the times that it seems to be collaborating with the US when it turned to the opening of the markets and market reforms, accepting transnational corporations operating in China have to create a commodity market as well as the labor market. They are not a wholesale adaptation of the neoliberal regime. So you argue that they have SOE still in commanding height, but they are operating with no differences as other large conglomerates. I think that is overlooking the significant difference that these SOEs have. For example, you mentioned the shareholder values. That is like dominating the SOE. But who are these shareholders? Shareholders, they are the state. Because, for example, the state banks, like Bank of China or the main big 4 or 5 that they have gone on listed on the exchanges, stock exchanges, but majority of the shares are still held by the state. They are not so-called freely transacted entirely on the shareholder market. So they have non-circulating shares. And also even when non-circulating shares have been nominally decreased to an insignificant share of the total shares, those that previously held the non-circulating shares, they are not selling their shares on the market, no matter how high the prices have gone. So they are still holding majority of this. And they are using these banks, for example, to implement the projects they have. The mega projects they have in 2028, I don't remember exact times, but also for now, we're developing high quality, qualitative, productive forces. These requires large capital. So these are against what's the typical shareholder values for short-termism. So they are different. And as I have explained in some of the cases, like how the oil and petrol companies in China operate, they are not really just going for profit. When the times is needed that they need to stabilize the domestic market, they would actually subsidize the domestic market from their own pocket. So this is a fundamental difference. And that's why China has been able to maintain high level of capital formation in the economy. It's not relying on the foreign capital. They are not investing that much in productive investment. And the poverty, I think, you talked about the peasants, how they are being commodified, and also maybe the creation of the working class proletarian, semi-proletarianization. This is part of the process in creating what they call the socialist market economy. Because in this market economy, yes, you have commodities and also you have labor that's available on the market. But at the same time, it's not entirely a free hand to the capitalists how they can conduct business there. For example, the poverty alleviation program that the state has embarked on is addressing one of these problems that's left in this process of creating the socialist market economy, because the countryside and even development and all the problems, that social economic problems that's left in the countryside, the state has actually recognized, and they needed to do something about it. And one of the things that's different in the compared to the welfare state is China is doing this through the party rebuilding process in the countryside. So it's a party-led and using the collective resources and also the state resources in trying to build a countryside economy that is able to withstand being taken over when they become successful by, for example, agribusinesses. So the land use rights could be transacted on the market, but the land right remains to be collected. That's not sellable. That's one of the things that how they actually protect the peasants, and also yes, the poverty alleviation is different to the welfare concept that people used to have about China. So you can see you have highlighted the trajectories, how the state responds to yes, okay, but then this is not just because of the pressures from the working class or from the lower classes in the society, but it's also because the state sees this as part of the national development project that they need to deal with. You have seen in Brazil, for example, the elections of the PT. Lula has been winning on 3 election campaigns with the mandate to actually avert neoliberalism, but could he really do this? So the institutional obstacles and also the things that's dominating in Brazil economy has shown a contrasting case that China is very different because he could deal with this and stop the neoliberal trend going on. So I think there are lots of differences that we need to recognize here. So that is my comments on your very clear. Question regarding is like you think China is just part of the U.S. central axis of accumulation?
China is supporting the US.
So maybe a very simple question is, do you recognize that for economy like China, do they need to have an accumulation regime? If that's necessary, then what should that look like?
Well, we have just 5 minutes. I'll try to answer briefly because also I'd like to pose. What? There has not been a break. Okay. Anyway, we'll answer briefly and then also pose particular questions regarding the paper also presented. I mentioned that what I mentioned is not that China was or in any moment promoting neoliberal policies. No, I said what's the transition to capitalism in China as a mode of production, not as state policies that address to, like Brazil, also have state policies that are addressed, for instance, to eradicate famine in Brazil. It doesn't make it socialist. Brazil also has state-owned enterprises, at least in the past, had that operating in the markets to administrate prices, to sustain the levels of living conditions in the country. No, it was never taught us, for instance, because of these particular characteristics as socialists on the ground of that. So what I told it, despite the fact that China did a transition to capitalism and established a developmentalist state, its insertion in global capitalism allowed to, enable to, was a central piece that materially sustained the strategies also of transnational corporations in pursuing a neoliberal order, in strengthening or heightening competition between workers among different countries, to reduce the bargaining power of workers in central countries, to reduce labor costs, to increase profitability of central countries. In as much as it fulfilled this role, it contributed to the neoliberal order, in as much as it's seen as an attack of capital on labor. It was a piece of this strategy. I'm not saying that China implemented neoliberal. Regarding the role of SOEs, these were like a summarization of some points that were discussed in the book. But what I told was not that it operated exclusively like a capitalist enterprise. What I told that they were increasingly operating like capitalists under capitalist logic, because you had a series of reforms that also, on the one side, promoted corporatization. Whether it doesn't mean that all enterprise, all SOEs operate like that, and so on and so forth. for us, state-owned enterprise or state property, it's more like a form, not a content. It can have different contents, and it also, state property is not socialized production per se. So, so this equation of, because you have a state-owned enterprise, it is a socialist logic? It doesn't follow necessarily. For instance, Brazil also had an industrialization in the past that counted, like you mentioned in another material, that there was industrialization with a large block of SOEs. But Brazil as well had the largest national, during its industrialization, national enterprise, where SOEs, the private enterprise, had a subordinate position. They were lesser. They're not so big as the state when you had multinationals, just in check. But anyway, for us, the central role of wage labor, of labor power as a commodity, that will introduce the generalized production of commodities and the pursuit of surplus value. But also have, of course, policies, instruments, including SOEs, to intervene in the economy does not change the overall production, relations of production, which were, of course, important as well in Mao's thinking, for instance. But regarding the questions that I would like to do regarding your presentation would be, first, you say that Brazilian agricultural sector, or the agribusiness in Brazil, it has a high productivity, and it's based on a high organic composition. And to provide some point, you take this Marxist category and you present a matrix of total factor productivity growth, which is based on the neoclassical production function and the principle of substitution and marginal productivity. How do you see these conceptual categories, or how total factor productivity illustrates some point regarding organic composition of capital in different sectors, since the core of the theories are absolutely different? Second point is, when you mention investment in infrastructure in Brazil, China's investment in infrastructure as possibly a promoter of development, and you mentioned and you highlighted, particularly 1 year, 2017. I'd like to stress that a huge part of Chinese foreign direct investment in the energy sector in Brazil, it's brownfield investment. It's not greenfield investment. It's like it's described in the broader process of denationalization, of destatization that's occurring in the Brazilian economy. So it's just a change, larger, maybe the largest parcel of that is just change of ownership of actually existing assets. So, and how this would be contributing to a national development strategy and a win-win situation. And this is not the point of who. It's not a discussion of who is guilty or who is not guilty. It's a discussion on whether, how our existing economic relations actually are, regardless of that. And another discussion is what they are, might be in the future. It doesn't change what they are actually in the moment. So there is another point that we'd like to stress, and a final question. And I really was appalled by that point, because maybe you are not aware of the specifics of Brazilian recent politics, but your co-authors certainly are. That when you mentioned at the end of the paper that one of the problems in Brazil is that the Lula government is constrained by actions or institutions made by other governments. And then you mentioned the independence of the central bank, and then you mentioned the spending cap for the public spending, which was made by Temer, but this was revoked. And Lula proposed another one, which is the one that's liberating, and they designed the current fiscal rule for spending. So I thought it was like, they can do nothing, but at the end of the day, the institutionality regarding the ceiling on fiscal spending, which is absolutely central for development, such as the Chinese case has already shown. Actually, Brazil in the past as well. It's not merely heritage of other bad governments, you see? And I believe that. Yeah, Elias know that was not. Made me apologize. Like, I know he defends the government, but to that extent, I wasn't aware. And then finally, the final point, which would be a question actually, is when you say about China might be important for promoting relations with Brazil that leads to sustainable development. You see, look, I would like to say the part of sustainable. Hey, of course, there are both sides of the question. Also, we have an agricultural instance is promoter of development anyway. But the part of sustainable in Brazil, you should see that our major problem relating to emissions and climate change is not from industry. It's made by deforestation, and deforestation is largely in Brazil being fueled by the expansion of agribusiness, soy and meat complex to China, to export to China. So when our problem is not exactly with the energy matrix, but with these results of the expansion of agribusiness. So how would this relationship sit in promoting sustainable development? Because it's not just a matter of substituting our energy matrix already clean, you see, and the major structural pressure that elevates CO2 emissions in Brazil comes from the current relations between Brazil and China in this profile of export. So this would be the second question. Thank you.
Appreciate your responses. But the other thing regarding the question that I had in the other story is what kind of accumulation regime that you think should have for economies like China? But I think maybe a very big question, and we can ponder discuss later on. So quickly regarding the productivity growth, the figures that I used was taken from research that done by others regarding the productivity. Yes. So this is largely will be assumed that is the rise in the organic composition of capital that is leading to productivity growth. I mean, I didn't really put in the OCC concept in my paper here, but I mean, for an unequal exchange, that is generally taken as if you have a higher productivity and then you trade with the partner, then those that with higher productivity, that means less variable capital in the composition of the whole input than those that have less of those then will be gaining in this exchange. But I think unequal exchange concept will have to be explained in another chapter or anything that's specifically on this subject. So I'm just throwing that concept here because I think people may have that kind of background knowledge anyway. So productivity growth and then the trade and then the services outflow, unequal exchange, that is quite linked. And I agree with you that the current trade pattern that China with Brazil, predominantly in agricultural produce, is not looking good on the green developments that Brazil needs. But and also this is a risk of reprimarisation for Brazil. This pattern continues, and this is the only pattern that goes on. So that is a recognized threat. But at the same time, this is not just because China is trading with Brazil that's making this happen. It has been an ongoing issue with the lack of other development in the Brazil's economy. One of the causes is the lack of infrastructure investment that I argue that is contributing partly to this problem that Brazil is having. So yes, in the trade, we can't really see much changes of this. But on the other hand, there is like investment in infrastructure and also the financing that Chinese is giving. You mentioned that for the foreign direct investment, it can be just about acquisition and mergers, taking over of local companies or assets. But on the other hand, we also see the overseas contracted projects that China is doing and also providing finances for. They are not part of the FDI. They are another category. So that is not about taking over some domestic companies, actually investing in projects that Brazil government is needed. And for the point that you highlighted is Lula government, present government, that inserted spending cap on government spending. I think that is a very good point. Thank you for mentioning that, because it's also a reflection of the difficulties for the PT government that even elected on a mandate to overturn neoliberalism. For themselves, within their own circle, they actually find it so difficult to do and also have to make compromises like this, not able to really fully implement industrial policy that can be completely against neoliberalism. So they are trying to balance so-called the interest of different parties in their own economy. And so creating the problems seems to be creating the problems for themselves. So that again showing the stark contrast with China, I think that how Brazil is conducting or confronting neoliberalism this way. Zeynab, I'm so sorry we have been just talking among ourselves here. But I think
I really enjoyed your discussion, and actually I learned a lot.
No, I think you did a brilliant presentation as well, because you highlighted the not entirely one way or the other, and that is a potential there. But do you see China is doing some kind of, Xi Jinping is talking about a new global governance and also initiative, for example, development, security, and also shared community for humankind. So these things, do you think they are mostly just rhetorics, or do you see any of these reflected in what your research has found out so far? Is anything that reflected they are trying to really push out a new global governance order that is not the that is very different to the current international or liberal international order so far? Do you see anything like that?
I think, as I've mentioned also in my PowerPoint, that the main purpose, based on my research and studies that I've had until now, China tries to address those gaps and problems and challenges actually that we have currently in the international liberal order, especially regarding to those countries like global South countries or the marginalized nation, or like regarding to the human rights issues, or like these stuff that somehow led some countries to be out of this system. So if we see the current practice, like ongoing practices that we have, the China relationship with the different regions, for example, in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, we see that China, through the different initiative, like for example in the BRICS or in the Shanghai organization, China tries to bring different countries without considering their background or the domestic features that these countries they have. But when we compare this approach with the Western, or especially the United States approach in the international relations, we always see that sometimes we have some standards that countries they need to accept, and then this is a kind of like requirements for their entry into the current liberal order. Otherwise, they will be marginalized. But for the China, I think this is a very I can call like a positive points that China doesn't consider this internal features of the country. So if we can work together, let's start to have a cooperation and that concepts and notions like the shared future or the different like initiative that already we have through the BRI or that global security initiative. So I think these are the main examples that highlighted China approach to the international liberal order and how China tries to amend those challenges or fill those gaps that we have. But for sure, China, I can say, is just at the beginning of this process. So and the international liberal order and also China approach are two dynamics entities, and both of them they will be involved in coming years. And for sure, the future world order will have some transformation in some aspects, but for sure there will be continuity, especially in terms of the principles of sovereignty, state sovereignty. So these are the observations that I've had about the China interaction with the international system and how China tries to fill those gaps that we have now.
Thank you. So
I think we reached our time, and I would like to thank all the presentators and people who accompanied us today in the discussions and presentations. And I wish you all a good morning, afternoon, night, wherever you are.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Professor Sam-Kee, for this opportunity.
great to have
I'm really thankful.
you. You're welcome. Okay, we'll see you
Thank you.
maybe in the next session.